Intersectionality refers to the mutually constructed nature of social division and the ways these are experienced, reproduced, and resisted in everyday life. A successful intersectional practice thus explores relational and reinforcing inclusions and exclusions, the first steps of which are to identify and name these. Intersectionality is basically a term that emerged from the writings of Black feminist writers who argued that the experiences of Black women could not be understood in terms of racism or in terms of sexism alone. Black women experience sexism differently from white women, and racism very much differently from Black men. Intersectionality has, however, been applied to other forms of inequality and is not necessarily limited to the experiences of people of color or women. Rather, intersectional approaches look at forms of inequality which are routed through one another and which cannot be untangled to reveal a single cause. Which basically means that every time we have things like women, person of color, and so on and so forth, we do not need to say it's a woman, full stop, or a person of color, full stop. But what we need to do is we need to link these concepts in order to explore how intersectionality works. And thus, intersectionality, instead of being likened to one aspect of identity, intersectionality makes different social positions and their underlying power relations visible. That does not mean that intersectionality is a completely unproblematic or indeed a very much easy to use term, even though it sounds like so. Not only has it been criticized for oversimplifying inequalities and reducing complex processes of interconnectedness to ordered interactions of different identity combinations, thus disregarding the sort of multi-dimensional nature of intersecting inequalities, intersectionality has also been problematized for not simultaneously meeting the needs, interests of conflicting groups, as it invites oppressions to compete, as it poses the infinite regress problem, which means that we're all ultimately reduced to singular individualities. While the criticisms of essentialism, basically, which have been leveled at this concept and which may come with assigning very stable identity categories, is a certainly valid concern and should not be disregarded. Some form of classification seems inevitable and somewhat indispensable in order to locate and differentiate between the processes of inequality. Moreover, as Westport has argued, by questioning these categorizations, the essentializing tendencies of the concept can be avoided, or if that isn't possible, at least adequately addressed. Now, what has all of that got to do with age? One approach to the intersections and inequalities of later life has suggested that old age, instead of reinforcing or enhancing social inequalities, actually helps to level them out, in the sense that groups become more alike regardless of their starting point as they age. As Calasanti and Slevin exemplify, such a leveling may occur, for instance, in terms of economic status. Since racial and ethnic minority groups and the poor begin with lower incomes, they have relatively less to lose than do members of the dominant group. As a result, the logic suggests that the gap between them shrinks as all groups feel the effects of retirement on their finances. However, so far research has absolutely failed to conclusively validate such assumptions, and we should be very careful with these assumptions. Rather, gerontologists have proposed that the disadvantaged and the privileged situations of older adults are a direct result not only of age, but of their positions in hierarchies based on gender, race, ethnicity, and social class over the course of their life course. Subsequently, older adults carry inequalities into old age at roughly the same rate and do maintain their status differences. Moreover, some older adults may certainly profit from this sort of cumulative advantage in later life, namely that the mostly economic privileges acquired in earlier stages of the life course allow for more possibilities to accumulate further advantage. This happens, for instance, in terms of health. That means if you have the means to afford good health, you are more likely to remain healthy in later life. And the same mechanisms also work in reverse, in that disadvantages are similarly compounded and thus increase disadvantages and inequalities in later life. Even though this structuring or this view somehow suggests that all of these inequalities, be it race, be it gender, be it class, are somewhat independent groups and that will be eventually studied separately, ethnicity, gender, and class should be related. Again, we should always see them next to one another, as all of them represent institutionalized practices and activities that maintain inequality. As such, the full scope of inequities and their effect can be scarcely captured by focusing on gender or ethnicity or class or age separately. After all, understanding difference and diversity is only one part. What should moreover be analyzed and understood are the differences that generate and are generated by inequality. As such, these categories need to and will be seen in connection to one another, as social inequalities comprise relations in which some groups lose authority, status, and wealth, and are stigmatized by others, and in which those disparities in life changes are justified as natural, divinely ordained, or rational, and thus beyond dispute. Such privileges and subordination exist in relation to one another, which means that the privileges of any one group are tied to the disadvantages of at least one other. By looking at the connections between inequalities, how they reinforce and legitimize or mitigate each other, questions such as what does it mean to be old in an increasingly diverse and unequal society? What does it mean to grow old as a member of one of these marginalized or stigmatized groups? Or how is diversity altering the terrain of old age and the experiences that go with it? Could be answered more sufficiently. Scholars in aging studies have long called for a so-called gender lens approach to older age that draws its theoretical basis from a feminist framework. As such, feminist perspectives have remained little used in gerontology. This does, however, not mean that only gender and gender differences in later life should be explored through this lens. Rather, this approach focuses on the relational character of various intersections, such as gender, ethnicity, class, and sexual orientation. As Calasanti and Slewin note, while older adults might be subjected to ageist practices, the experiences of old age may vastly differ if age is intersected with class, with ethnicity, kann ich jetzt das Wort nicht mehr aussprechen? Oh, for fuck's sake, intersected with class, ethnicity, or with gender. Thus, for instance, patterns of discrimination experienced by older people of color might not simply be explained by references to age, ethnicity, gender, or class alone, but might instead be an amalgamation, a mix of multiple discriminatory practices, some of which carry over from youth or middle age. As such, the experiences of aging are not homogeneous or appear spontaneously, but they are shaped in relation to one another. Viewing age through this lens then allows for an understanding that incorporates multiple perspectives and realities, both on the individual and on structural levels, and thus emphasizes notions of diversity when approaching older age. Moreover, such a gender lens lends itself to study perspectives outside of privileged or normative frameworks that are often applied to the study of old age. While the experiences of older white middle-class adults have formed much of the basis for most research in aging studies and gerontology, this foundation has been scarcely criticized, leaving experiences of older people of color, working class retirees, or the experiences of older adults in the LGBTQ spectrum underexplored and under-theorized. Therefore, a theoretical approach that views sources of oppression and privilege as sources of resistance and strength may help to uncover realities that may otherwise remain hidden. As such, retirement, for instance, can be analyzed from various angles. On the one hand, retirement has been viewed as a largely androcentric experience that is a male-based or male-focused experience, in which this threshold signifies for men a loss of power and status, rendering them other men who are not economically or socially productive any longer. Yet this view does not only reinforce the idea that work is necessarily paid and productive, but it also glosses over the fact that retirement for women may simply be perceived as a shift, or in fact not a shift at all, from paid labor to unpaid labor at home, for instance, in the form of informal care arrangements for both partners or older family members, something that is more often done by women than it is by men. Moreover, this perspective on retirement as an event shaped by a clearly defined time at which one enters and exits the labor force is a majority perspective, which erases or ignores other gender, class, and ethnic biases. However, the interrelations between various inequalities are not necessarily disadvantages. Indeed, Calasanti and King state that age simply alters inequalities in various and more complex ways. In this vein, older age might, for instance, be regarded as a time of hardship for women due to lower pensions, cultural invisibility, or the loss of desirability. However, on the other hand, these changes also subject women or older women less to the compulsory heterosexuality that saddles and exploits younger women, and that will of course be something that we will deal with later on in this seminar quite extensively.